This video will show you some borders that are already in the Embird program, and will also show you how you can use them in a test file. Hi, Shelley here from Embroidery Studio. In this video, I hope that you will learn how to find some sources for border ideas, how Embird borders can be changed through the parameters window, and how to stitch out a test border. I know you'd like to go right on to how to make a one-pass border, but it's really helpful to understand how the embroidery works, and by using some of the native borders you'll get a better feel for how the parameters work. First of all, I'd like to explain the types of borders that Embird can do. The first type of border is what I call a one-pass border. It starts on the left, it goes into the boundary area of a border, and then it ends on the right. Depending on how you do it, it can have some column parts that extend beyond the boundary box, but overall the connection part must start on the left boundary and end on the right boundary. It can contain column objects, line objects, and connections. Those are the only three things that it can contain. If you're watching this video, I'm sure you have an embroidery machine. One of the best places to get ideas about how borders work is to look at the stitches, your fancy stitches on your embroidery machine. Here are some examples from my machine. It was really interesting to watch the machine stitch this. It starts down here, it works around here, it comes back, goes up here, goes up there, and then continues over. There are many different examples on your machine. You can see the start mode here, the end node there. Here's a very geometric one, but it has to retrace its steps in order to get from A to B. And here's another one that has some straight line stitching, but also some fill. So these are a good place to look to get ideas for how you might do your own border. The second type of border is a two-pass border. The first pass can have connections and column objects. The second pass can have line objects and connections. You can use a different color on the first pass and the second pass. Now we're going to look at some of the borders that come with the Embird program. We go to Design, Border, Open Border. Here are some of the designs that come with the program. The first one we're going to look at is a zigzag or rickrack type of border. So we just open that with a double click. Here is the border. If we highlight it and look at the editing mode, Control E, we can see that it is a column object. You can see the dotted line at the beginning of the column and then dotted line at the end of the column. The nodes are very evenly spaced on this, and when you look down at the bottom there are no gaps on the rendering. It looks like the node is right exactly in the location where the two ends of the border meet. So that is a very simple rickrack border. One of the peculiarities of the borders programs, or the borders designs, is that whatever they look like in this border square, when you actually stitch them out in a line element in a regular Embird design, they will change their shape a little bit depending on what parameters you set. When you change it in the border window, you don't see any of those changes. So within what is in this window may look a little different than what actually gets stitched out. And that's one reason it's very important to test borders out. If we look over at the parameters, or the design area here, we can see that it is a column object. And if I click on it and go Control P to see the parameters, it's density 4, although when you go to set it in the regular program you can change that. And it does have underlay. You can take that off if you want to. And anyway, these are just the regular things. One thing, you can generate the stitches. So if I go Apply and Generate Stitches, you can see what it looks like. And it looks like it has a really nice shape to the zigzag stitching. So it looks pretty good. After we have generated the stitches, we can go OK. And then down here we can see a 3D view. I have stitched out this border several times and it stitches out very nicely. So it's a great border. It really does look like commercial rickrack. So that's what that border looks like. The next border we're going to look at is a circle border. So it's here on border number 8. Double click to open it. And it looks like it might be a shape, but when we actually go in and click over here and look at the elements, it actually was stitched as a column. You can see the beginning of the column and the end of the column there. This border I have stitched out, and it stitches out beautifully. It is composed of a line or column object, and then the second element, and I'm just going to escape out of this, the second element is a connection, and that is right there. So when this border stitches, the column object starts here. I'll just show you, you can see the node there where it starts stitching, and then the column object ends here, and then this connects up with the connection object. So when it gets to here, it's in the right position to stitch the next circle. So it works very well. It's a beautiful border and very useful. You can use it for a lot of different things. I'm just going to generate the stitches so you can see what it looks like. One peculiarity is that it doesn't show it as being filled in here. It seems to show the underlay, but in actual fact it stitches out as a satin stitch depending on the size you set. Anyway, it is a very nice border, and again composed of a column object and a connection object. Pass. The next border we're going to look at is a rope border, and this here you can see something a little different that's happening. This border actually starts outside of the boundary box, and it continues past the boundary box, and that's okay as long as there's nothing that interferes with the stitching, and you can see that it does line up perfectly. If we look over here at the components of this one, we have a connection object first, and the machine figures out how to connect it. It actually has a node up at the top of the box. It starts the column object outside of the boundary box. So that's the connection that works on that one. The next object, I'm just going to escape out of that one, the column object right here, if we look at the nodes on that, it begins down here. It does some underlay. We can't see that in this drawing, but it actually does stitch out a bunch of underlay. And then it ends up here, and the connection, I'm not sure exactly how that works, but the connection lines up there, and it begins with a connection and stitches again. I think what probably happens is the connection goes down here, and then it stitches again. Anyway, this does stitch nicely. It's a rope border, and I have stitched this one out, and it looks quite nice. When you actually stitch it out, this is more like satin stitching here. One thing I forgot to show you in the previous borders is that if you go over to the parameters here and click on them, if you go to the global parameter, this is where you can see the name of the border, and it is important to name your border in the comment box here as well as save your border. I'm not sure why it's arranged that way, but it is really important to do both. Okay, so that's your rope border. This one also has a 2-pass border that I'm not going to talk about in this video, but it ends up being used later for a 2-pass border that can be done in 2 different colors. The next border we're going to look at is a leaf border. This is a very nice border, and I'll show you a stitch out of it later in the video. The way this border works, it starts with the connection object on the left. It has column objects which get stitched out, and then it ends with a connection object on the right. So the beginning of the border and the end of the border match up perfectly. If we look at the objects over here, it starts with a column object. Notice that it goes all the way up to the tip of the leaf, and then it's going to satin stitch and end up back down so that it's at the bottom node. So the leaf is the next one as a column object. Then it has a connection, oops, I turned the eye off, has a connection object that goes to the tip of the second leaf, and then it stitches back, oh, I keep turning it off, stitches back to the bottom of that node, and the final object is a connection. And the node on the final object, if we go Control E, that node is perfectly placed to line up with the beginning of the stitch out. You can see the stitch out down on the bottom, and that's how it works. Now, I can generate stitches for this border, and if you want to generate stitches for the whole thing, you just go over here and highlight it, then go Control G. This does stitch out as a solid satin stitch, and I'm not sure why it renders that way. If we look at it in 3D, it actually is filled in the stitch out, which you'll see later. It does show the underlay in this. Anyway, you see no connections or things that are untoward down here. One thing that you can look at is if we click the little eye icon, you can see that that dotted red line is where the beginning of the border matches up to the end of the border. And you will always see this if you do the jump stitch. If you jump stitch toggle button, if you see more jumps or connections than that, that's when you have a problem. So that's the leaf border, and I will show you a stitch out later. And the last border we're going to look at that's in the Embird program is a leaf border that has a wide heart-shaped leaf. Oops. And I apologize, for some reason my video capture is sometimes lagging a little bit, so we're missing a few cursor strokes. Anyway, here is a leaf border, and I will be showing you an example of this one stitched out. This is similar to the last border in its construction. It begins with a connection object, and it stitches to the end of the leaf at the point there. Then, in this case, it stitches one half of the leaf as a column object, and then it has a connection, and it goes up to the tip again, and then it stitches the other half of the column object. It has a further connection going down to the point of that leaf, and then it does the same thing. It stitches half of the leaf, has a connection, and stitches the other half of the leaf, and it ends with a connection. In order to look at the overall nodes, we can drag a selection square around the whole thing, and we can go to Control G to generate the stitches and see what it looks like. And then we can go to Control E to see the actual points down below. I have stitched this border out, and I will show you an example of it. Personally, I find this one very, very densely stitched. It's interesting to note that in the parameters of this one, in general, they've left the reference parameters at 5 for most of the other borders. But this one has a global parameter set at 25, so that's the smallest you should stitch it. And my sample is stitched out at 25 by 25, and it's literally bulletproof, so I'm not really fond of this one, and I'm showing it to you in a sense as an example of pretty tight stitching that you might want to avoid in a border. One of the challenges is that we're using vector drawings here, and we can make them look really detailed and everything, but when we actually physically stitch them out, those stitches can end up being very, very tiny. So we do have to be careful about our overall size when we're doing these borders. So this is the last example, and in the next video I'm going to start showing you how to load these borders and use them, and then I will show you a final stitch out. Here we are in regular Embird Studio now, and we're just in the regular design area. I have loaded a test design that I use, and if you watched my first not very good video, because it was my first, I showed you how to do a test file, but we're just going to improve it a little bit in this video. So in this design I have taken regular straight line objects, outline objects, if you look over here, and I've just bent the lines a little bit so that, because I use my borders generally in a curved fashion. So I'm just going to add one more piece to the test file now, and I'm going to choose a line object. I'm going to make one node, then I'm going to shape, and I'm going to pick an 8-element circle, and if I hold down the Control key, when I pull it out, it will be an actual circle, and then I can go to the elements, and then I can finish the object, and now we have a circle. So you can use borders in circles and rectangles and all the different shapes. when you're using a border, what you're doing is you're taking a line object, and instead of having a single stitch or a feather stitch or a triple bean stitch or redwork, instead of that you're choosing a border. So I'm going to show you what to do with these native Embird borders. So the first, oops, I'm going to put that circle up on top. So I'm going to click on it, I'm going to right click, drag it up to the top, and insert it before. I do like to keep my objects in the same order that they actually are on the canvas. So with the circle border, I'm going to look at parameters now, Control P, and I'm going to choose the rope border. Because we're using borders that are already in Embird, they're already loaded, so we don't have to actually load the border. So I'm going to choose the rope for this one. Oh, I have to toggle border first, and that is the rope that is a 2-pass. We're going to use the rope that's just a 1-pass, so it's rope number 2. I'm leaving it at 5 millimeters for both the what is actually the height and the length of the border. I'm going to go apply and generate stitches, and now you can see what it renders to look like. Now if I were to change the size, it would, this time we could actually see the changes. So if I change the what is actually the height here, let's change it to let's try 9, okay, and you have to click the green check to accept it. And then if I left the width, let's change the width. I'll put it at 8 and accept that. If I click apply and generate stitches, now I can see what that change looks like. So this is the area where you can actually play with the borders and get them to the sizes that you want. So I'm going to go back to 5 because that's what I actually stitched it out in. So I'm going to go back to the default, which was 5 millimeter, and it was 5 millimeter here. And because there are so many things you can do with, now we're back to the original, I do keep track of this, and I'll show you my sample and how I do keep track of it. So that's the rope border, and that's what it'll stitch out to look like. The next, I'm going to go down, I'm finished with that now. I'm going to go down to the next border, and I'm going to look at the parameters again, Control P, and I'm going to go into the border toggle, and this time I'm going to pick the leaf that we did, the long leaf. Okay, and for the long leaf I used 15 for the width, and I used 15 for the length. So if I go apply and generate stitches, there's my leaf. Okay, in the next video you're going to see the rest of these filled out. We are in Embird Studio right now, and I'll show you a test out file that I've made to test some of the native Embird borders. The first one highlighted here, I've made a circle, and the borders will follow a shape like that and go around in a circle. So I started with an outline object and then turned it into a circle. Notice that I've left this at the default. The width, which is actually the height of from here to here, of the border is 5 millimeters, and the width down here is 5 millimeters. I'm going to use the word length for that because this is one of the confusions that I think happens to people. Anyway, we'll close that one. Okay, the next border, the parameters of that, Control P, are 15 for the height of the border, so from here to here within the design is 15 millimeters, and then the length is also 15, so from here to here, 15. Okay. Next one is, I think I called it the Zig Zag, but I guess a better name would be Rickrack, and it does look like bought Rickrack. The width is 6, or height, sorry, is 6, the length is 6, and that's a fairly good size. Okay. The next one is the same border, and it's done in a smaller size. So the height is 2 millimeters, so they're just very tiny. And then the width is slightly wider, or the length, sorry, is 3 millimeters. Next one is the circle that's in Embird, and it is, I think I left it in what they had it in the program, so 8 millimeters for the height, and the length is 10 millimeters. And the last one is the leaf, and this is quite a big one. and in the program the width is 20. I've set it at 25 millimeters, and the length is 25 millimeters. Now this is the maximum. This will stitch out quite large. I would not do this in a small size because it's just too dense. It's just too complicated. Okay, that's it. This is what it would be in Studio, and the next step would be that I would take this into Embird Editor. Here's the same test file using native borders, and I've taken it into Embird Editor. It looks okay. One thing that I generally do is I take out the trimming codes when I'm doing samples because they tend to make a mess on the back of my embroidery. My machine trims, but it gets kind of thick, so I usually take those out. I have purposely varied the colors, one color, second color, third, first color, second color. I do that because it's easier to see. I do not always stitch these out in order. If we have a very dense design, for instance the last one, it's a good idea. I don't like stitching it out first because it tends to really pucker the material. Anyway, these are just tests, but it will give you an idea, and I'll show you the stitch out. Here is the final sample of my test stitch out. Notice that I keep track of what thread I've used up at the top and what bobbin thread. Also, to remember how I've recorded the numbers, I've put a little chart here for I use the width or the height by the length. Notice that here's the original rope in 5.5, which was the default for that one, 15 by 15 for the leaf, and I think that was also the default. The rickrack I've stitched out in two sizes. This size here stitched out really nice. This one is nice and usable, but it's very dense, so I would not go any smaller than the 2 millimeter by 3 millimeter. The circles, this was the default, stitches out very nicely. And these leaves are a little too thick, in my opinion, even though they're stitched out at 25 by 25. The problem with these is that the columns overlap each other, and that results in a nice visual effect, but it's very, very dense in the middle. So I would not probably use this border unless I did some serious work with the density or how it was stitched out. I might make another one and take the overlap out of those columns because it is too dense. Anyway, this is the end of showing you how to use the native borders in Embird, and in the next video I'll be showing you how to compose your own border composed of connection stitches and column stitches. Please, this is my second video. I'm trying to learn how to do this in a focused and effective way, and I welcome any comments that you might have. Thank you very much for listening to my video.